say hi to Mitch when I see him.
Yeah. If you need anything having to do with fake news, our panel are the folks you should talk to. Let me introduce them to you and also call your attention as you look at the rolling screen here. We have the hashtag, if you're a Twitter person, mind the gap MN. The MN is important, otherwise you get in a really weird space with just mind the gap. We've discovered that. Just saying. I want to first start out at the far end of the panel. Scott Libin from the University of Minnesota. He's a senior fellow at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Scott really deserves an extra thanks. I met with him early in the summer when the ill-formed idea, or really not formed idea, of this event was ruminating through my mind, and he helped me put some structure on it. So Scott, number one, thank you for that. Next to him, you can hold your applause, you know, it's the Emmys kind of thing. Maria Reeve from the Star Tribune. Maria is the assistant managing editor for news. She is also the president of the Twin Cities Black Journalists Association. Next to her is Tom Stewart, who is an award-winning investigative journalist and does specializing communication specialty in public affairs and special reports. He currently is with the Center of the American Experiment doing communications activities. And finally, our esteemed moderator, Rick Capcella, who is the founder and CEO of the IE Network, which is a marketing communications firm here in the Twin Cities. Before he got the entrepreneurial bug, Rick was an award-winning anchor and investigative journalist at KARE 11. With that, we will go into this. If you've been at a Citizens League event, you know it's basically half them. Then we throw it open to the crowd. Rick will turn into Oprah and take this out into the crowd. He will never let go of the microphone, so don't try to take it from him. And any and all questions are welcome. So thanks for joining us.
Super. All right, Jan, thank you very much. Thanks to the Citizens League. We appreciate it. This is going to be a fun night. It's great to be with you guys. I mean, we go back, like, you know, to the original tablet. It came with a chisel. It's going to be a fun night with everybody here. So the conversation tonight, brought to you by the Citizens League, around fake news, right? And I think that really they asked me to do this because Jan Onstead knows that my wife would tell you I can't fake a damn thing, okay? So it's not me you got to worry about over here. It's that guy with the glasses over there at the far end of the table. Just be very careful with that one. Seriously, we appreciate your participation, and you will be participating, as Jan mentioned a little while ago. Half of the 90-minute session, we're going to be out there with you, kind of just cajoling you, prompting you for your own questions to the degree that's necessary. I know for some of you that could be painful. But we're just asking that you don't make it painful for the rest of us. So if you're paying attention to what's going on here, be ready to ask questions of this panel, because these are some very smart, highly evolved people at the table. The challenge today, just in the way of kind of setup, what I'm going to offer up as the challenge here today is, and it's an opportunity for some, is what's happened with the disintermediation of the press over the course of the last decade, certainly a little better than a decade for sure, and how that has revealed seriously variant standards for truth in publishing. There are so many places that we can go for news and information today, and that's not entirely new, though, I want to point out. You know, before the major consolidation of all the media groups that occurred in the 70s and the 80s, you know, there were like 1 billion little papers out there reporting from all corners, and it's astonishing the amount of fake news that has actually been in production, going back like a couple hundred years, actually, well documented, since literally the founding of this country, at least. People have been getting away with all kinds of crap, okay? Including the 1800 presidential election, when the Federalists claimed that just before the election, got wide coverage, that their opponent, Thomas Jefferson, was dead. It was carried widely. Jefferson won anyway. Ben Franklin has written at length about the value of the fake news that he was producing. And much more recently, I forgot this, but you're going to remember it, I'm sure. Much more recently, Karl Rove, working on behalf of George W., in a primary battle, moved to take out John McCain with a robocall that asked primary voters if they'd be more or less likely to vote for McCain if they knew that he had fathered an illegitimate black child. Do you remember that?
It didn't say he did.
He did, right? It didn't say he did. It just, would you be more or less likely to vote for him if you knew? Which, you know, Mother Jones gave him, docked him 2 points for simply implying that he had an illegitimate child of mixed race. But they gave him a couple points for swinging like that in his own party. Okay. The parallels throughout history are kind of stunning. People have been led to believe quite recently, you know, that Barack Obama is born somewhere else, that the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. And we have this president stirring the pot, mislabeling the hell out of everything. Now CNN and the New York Times are fake, right? Because it works to his advantage. Some people use their newfound media ability for good, others not so much. So tonight, it's not even so much that it's new, but fake news is as relevant as ever. And I'd like to start off, first question with the panelists here, really around how do you define, each of you just, whoever wants to start is fine. How do you define what it is and what it is not?
Can I start with what it is not?
Surely.
I would argue it's not some of the things that we just talked about. It's not political sabotage. I think that's a craft in itself, right? The term fake news, in fact, though I believe that phrase is only a couple of years old, has changed dramatically since its invention. It actually meant for a few minutes, or maybe a few months, what we used to call a hoax. It was news that was not flawed news, not irresponsible or even incompetent news, but news that was wholly fabricated and intended to spread and mislead people. It has, since then, courtesy of our president, become sort of a generic pejorative that you just use against anybody or anything you don't like. At least that's my take on it.
I'd agree with that. Can you hear me? Okay. That there are two definitions. There's the news that is made up, that's fake news, and there's also the news you don't agree with. So what we see a lot of is people will email or write saying, oh, you're fake news. Well, it's not fake because we don't do fake news. It's a point of view that they don't agree with. And so we hear a lot of that because I do think that the president has coined a phrase that people have grabbed onto and feel quite comfortable like using to discredit something they don't agree with.
And I agree with everything you guys have just said, but I would say the news media has it coming to a certain extent too. There have been very high profile cases of where they just got it wrong, dead wrong. And having been in the business, you know, most of my life too, journalists don't take that very well. You know, they don't acknowledge it very well. That
but
clarification.
the credible outlets.
Well, CNN did fire their investigative
people.
team.
We do corrections when we're wrong. We admit that.
Yeah, and all I'm suggesting is that the media has kind of laid the groundwork for Trump to take it as far as he has, you know, to a certain extent. And it doesn't take more than 2 or 3 high-profile instances of malpractice, media malpractice, among the thousands of stories that get done the right way to really, when you got that kind of a pedestal and podium to drive home that point. And I agree with you, Scott, that is what most people think of as fake news now. It's become shorthand for media bias.
And we could spend the evening talking about other forms of flawed news. I don't dispute what you're saying. I've, to some extent made a career of trying to learn from my own mistakes and the mistakes of others. So I'm not suggesting the news is pure by any means.
Right.
But fake news is not the same as a story that is, what were the popular criticisms of news 10 or 20 years ago? Sensational news or biased news. Those things are damaging. There's real harm involved. But they're news that you just don't think was executed properly. And often you're right. It's not. Fake news is something different. And I think the big change over the centuries, as you point out, Rick, is that now it travels at the speed of light.
Right.
And so it goes viral. And once upon a time, those stories were contained only to those who got the robocall or those who reported on it. Nowadays, anybody's voice can reach the ends of the world, right? And as I'll paraphrase briefly my favorite Edward R. Murrow quote, but he said, just because your voice reaches the far ends of the earth doesn't mean you're any wiser than when it reached only the end of the bar. And these days, our voices can all reach the ends of the earth.
Right.
And it is a worldwide phenomenon. Go online and do a little bit of research. It's in every country. I mean, countries around the world are dealing with the same thing we are right now. I mean, sifting through what's fact and fiction so their people have information they can count on.
So when I listen to you guys, I'm looking for, just tell me I'm missing it or something, but I'm looking for somebody to acknowledge that there is actually today, all these things you're saying are true, they're all component parts, but what I'm reading is some distance around the idea that there is real and damaging deliberate efforts to perpetuate fake news, false stories in the context of news for unscrupulous ends.
Well, Facebook just this week, or last week was it, we finally found out, after Zuckerberg laughed it off a couple days after the election, that indeed Facebook has been complicit, unknowingly, no doubt, but they were a platform for at least $100,000, which is a drop in the bucket, of Russian-linked political advertising, okay? That amounted to, in the last 4 months of 2016, according to the piece I read, 0.1% of all the social engagement on Facebook during that time. So it's not like it swung the election necessarily, but they didn't even own up to it. There's a lack of transparency in these online platforms as well that I think you need to get to at the same time, without threatening or stifling the very, First Amendment rights that we all have. There's something going on in Washington right now where they're really looking at behind the scenes regulation, which is kind of scary, but it's also being brought on, I think, by sort of revelations like this out of nowhere.
I would add, I think fake news can be done for fun or profit. And the profit isn't necessarily financial, but driving traffic can have a sort of a monetary element to it. There can be a political motivation. And I think some of it is just a bunch of guys sitting around with nothing better to do, trying to decide how outrageous a lie can we spread, and how
and
far
some
will
of it is really funny.
Well, it is funny, yeah, or it would be if it weren't so sad, right?
Well,
yeah, it is. On its face, look, 20 years ago or so, on a weekend in this market, somebody faxed to all the newsrooms in town.
I was thinking of that.
You know the one I'm going for?
Yeah.
A story that said, and fax was the high-tech medium of the time, that said that First Avenue was moving from the street that gave it its name to 187th Street in Brooklyn Park or something like that. One station in town, of which I was not news director at the time,
At the time.
Later I was. My television station at the time did not run the story because we thought it was a little suspicious and perhaps not coincidence that the date was April 1st. Another television station with a skeletal overnight weekend staff led its Sunday morning newscast with a live report from outside First Avenue. would have been a big deal if it were true, right?
So they didn't check?
Well, it was overnight on it was like 5 o'clock on a Sunday morning or something that they would otherwise presumably have vetted this, but didn't.
There aren't many people around the station at that time of the day.
No, there really aren't. That's kind of frightening. And today, if it's mathematically possible, there would be fewer, even than there were 20 years ago. But so that was a hoax, right? The term fake news hadn't been invented, but that's basically what it was. And it worked. It traveled in an analog sort of fashion rather than digital, by fax, which we all thought was pretty cool. It turns out you could cut and paste in the literal sense and get some letterhead. And those have always been embarrassing things. And you're right, Tom. I mean, and I'll say this for television more than newspaper. Television has not set the bar real high when it comes to getting fooled. It wasn't the first or the last time.
Right. And that's why, for us, I mean, we tell reporters, especially young ones, if it's too good to be true, check it and check it again. I mean, we get stuff across the transom all the time that, if you're in a rush, if you don't have enough people, you might slip something in, but, you have to check. And that's what we tell readers who call in, and people like you. You are bombarded with all kinds of avenues for information. So Twitter, if you're on Twitter, I mean, that stuff comes, it does this. Facebook, wherever you get your news, be discriminating about what you choose to believe. You can look in the web address and sometimes see, like, that's not ABC News, so if we get to that, you have to be discriminating about where you get your information. I have 3 kids. One of them's not online yet, thank God, but the older 2, the 20 and 18-year-old, that's how they pass information along. And I question them. It's like, how do you know that's true? Well, because my friend sent it to me. Well, you don't know. Like, what's the original source? Where is there original reporting? And so we just ask people to be, know what you're reading, know where you got it from.
So everybody acknowledges that there is some share of deliberate attempts to fool the public for ill-gotten reasons. Everybody recognizes that. Do you, Maria?
Yes.
You okay? I'm just checking. I wasn't got it on the record there. Who shares responsibility for this? I mean, what's the group? What are the groups that share responsibility? Obviously, the producers of this stuff do. We're talking about that stuff that is deliberately fraudulent and designed to move people in some direction that isn't real, right? The producers share some responsibility. You alluded to the mediums like Facebook, Zuckerberg. Who else shares responsibility? To what degree does the public?
If you consume this without trying to find, where the source is, I think you're somewhat complicit in, especially if you get something, you pass it along.
Before I came here, there's a guy working on my house, a good friend of mine in the neighborhood. And I just asked him, I said, what do you think of the fake news? And he said, there's just a whole lot of stuff out there to wade through. And I mean, and to sort through. And it's a mess. And I think that's really kind of the common view, but I don't know any other way around it. But then you take the time to sort through it and really figure out what's what, or you have your trusted sources, I guess, but then you kind of become siloed yourself in your point of view, and you're not seeking out, a greater diversity of opinion and views, and so I mean, but I do think it begs the question: how do you sort through it, and what do you tell your people, Scott, in class and so on?
Right. I had this conversation with a captive audience of a couple of hundred young people this morning, and we talked about this issue. I think the silver lining is what you just said, Tom. It's that audiences today, it's not enough to tell people what happened anymore, what went on while you were at work today, or yesterday, or overnight. They are bombarded constantly by information. Some of it is news, some of it is not, but what trusted sources or brands, and I emphasize the S on the end of both those, what they do is help people sort through that barrage and give them some idea of what or whom to believe. And I think that's where the media have a heightened responsibility and where they have a heightened opportunity as well. But if you have one source or brand that you trust, because the people there are obviously smart, they agree with me, that's not being a media literate person, right? I mean, a lot of news organizations have rules that say you've got to have at least 2 independent sources to go with an enterprise or an investigative story. I think we're beginning to ask that now of consumers as well.
Do you guys think, you kind of alluded to this a minute ago, Tom, but is there a credible risk of that this kind of lying behavior aimed on these kind of platforms of the public at large, particularly in political space, but broadly, could bring about reforms that would, put in quotes, limit free speech, First Amendment rights? Is there a credible risk that this occurrence of fake news and questions around, did it influence the election? Did it do, that this could somehow lead to limitations on free speech?
I'd hope not. I mean, I think the market has to do that somewhat, and that I think we as an organization or newspapers in general would be against that. There is a danger. There's a danger in having fake news out there and having people question the credible sources, and I don't say that with a huge degree of arrogance, but I think that mainstream media, our legacy newspaper, is a credible source, and that for us, our readers, I hope, trust us and don't become jaded by the occurrence of fake news.
I believe there was, though, discussion in the campaign about regulation, of when fake news came up. I think that there was some discussion of that last year, and I think that's really, really dangerous.
Dangerous.
Yeah. Very.
Well, when President Trump was a candidate, he did talk about, and I think I'm quoting him accurately, opening up the libel laws. Yeah. I think he spoke of the federal libel laws, which fortunately don't exist. I mean, you can't open up what isn't there, but he did clearly tap into a distrust among the public and a feeling at the gut level, if not the constitutional scholarly level, that you shouldn't be able to say some stuff. Some people would argue that's ironic coming from a candidate who got away with saying stuff by his own admission that most people couldn't say. But
I mean, at one level, how come you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, but you can yell, the president has tapped my phone lines in the last election cycle?
Right. Well, who's the lawyer up here? I'm not, for the record. But you know what you're making an important point, and that is there are some limits on all constitutional rights. I mean, the First Amendment is not absolute. We know there are things that are illegal. They are speech, but we're not free to do them without consequence. And then there's the issue of prior restraint versus, punishment for some of these illegal forms of speech. But I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I won't take it much further than that.
But there's always been a high bar for not being able to do that. Witness the New York Times absolutely libeling Sarah Palin in an editorial 2 months ago. They admitted it. They got it wrong for about the third time in that particular fact. She sued him, but the federal judge did toss it out because there's a higher bar than
standard of proof.
Yeah, absolutely. But the Times admitted they were wrong. They absolutely got it wrong. And it wasn't the first time on that particular
But journalistic
point.
organizations are, in fact, protected at a higher degree when the target is a political or otherwise public figure.
Well, let me just say, not just journalistic organizations, we're all protected, right? It's much harder to libel Sarah Palin than it would be a private person. Right. And, our courts have upheld that reckless disregard standard for a long time. So absolutely, this wasn't even a close call. It was an objective inaccuracy in the Times. I think it was an editorial.
Yeah, it was.
Which doesn't make it okay, but for the record, it wasn't a news report, it was an opinion piece. But she is, by any definition, a public figure, and so a lot harder to harm in the sense that the law would recognize it of a private person.
Or to state alternatively, it's a lot easier to get away with.
Yeah.
Going after a public figure.
In the Times' defense, it did correct that fairly prominently, did apologize and very publicly acknowledge its mistake. So that, I don't know what legal value that has, but it has some value at the ethical level, I think.
How much of a problem is it for the mainstream media when the President of the United States is squarely going after major mainstream news organizations and repetitively pummeling them as fake? Is that a problem? Is that a whiner? How serious is that?
So this summer, I belong to the National Association of Black Journalists. At our convention, there was a panel that had April Ryan. Do you know who April Ryan is? She's the reporter that at some point Sean Spicer was, going after. Abby Phillips, who's Washington Post White House correspondent. So the panel was all these White House correspondents, and it was an hour and a half of them just saying, every day we go in there, we sit down, we do our jobs. Every day we know that this administration is coming at us, and every day we remember that we are there to report and write and tell the truth as far as they will tell us what the truth is, and that they know that each afternoon there will be something. But it does kind of chip away. But I was impressed that these reporters, like, they were not at all deterred. They were not at all feeling like, oh my God, this again with these people. But they go into their work straight-faced and clear-eyed and do their work. But it does take, I think it chips away, or it attempts to chip away at the credibility of mainstream media when you have the president or his representatives saying New York Times is fake news, CNN is fake news, when those legacy organizations, in my view and our view, is not.
It's a little scarier to me when he goes after individuals, and he has, by name.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just read a review of the new book by NBC correspondent Katie Tur, who once had to be escorted out of a campaign rally by the Secret Service because then candidate Donald Trump was exhorting people, to turn, and she was looking at people who were pointing at her and shouting at her, and I don't know how I'd hold up under that kind of pressure. It's one thing to go after a brand, a CNN or the failing New York Times. When it's an individual, boy, I don't know if I'm as tough as some of these people.
I definitely agree with that. There's also the case of Cheryl Atkinson, whose laptop was compromised by a federal government IPO or whatever, a URL, they still haven't gotten to the bottom of that, but that was an absolute breach of her laptop and her confidential information and sources, and so this isn't, that's another form of it as well. I mean, I know for me though, as a reporter, when somebody challenges me, especially if they're in an official position, that only inspires you. I mean, there's not a chance that that's...
Well, and I will say, I tell my students, this is not the field to go into if you are as thin-skinned and delicate and fragile as I think young people are sometimes unfairly generalized as being. But you cannot, I don't believe you should go into journalism if you want to be loved.
What about president? I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Some of you had, in conversations we've had in the past, have suggested that this kind of repetitive beating that doesn't just come from on high, but there's definitely a vein of populism in this "you guys are fake" mantra. But some of you have suggested that actually has a real silver lining to it in the sense of media response and accountability just internally ramping. Can you explain that to me a little bit? Maria?
We don't exist without readers. We have to be responsive to the public and to people who, you know, pay to get the information that we put out. And so it makes us more responsive. I mean, we get, you know, emails, calls, people wanting to, and there's some of them like you just don't answer because it's just too much. But there are, you know, thoughtful people who want to engage us on why did you write this? Why did you write it this way? Why did you exclude this fact and include this thing? And so we try to take that seriously and answer our readers when they engage with us. The other thing it's done is it makes us, not that we weren't before, but more careful in a way. Because if you are going to get those questions, it has to be defensible. And we have to be able to defend why we took this angle or ignored this event or covered these things.
And you can predict today you are more likely to get those questions than maybe 20 years ago. Not that they didn't come 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, post-election was like November 9th. It felt like it changed. It went boom.
I saw it change in
Yeah,
the paper. You're covering different kinds of stories. Some of them are just really interesting, and it's very clear. I think there had to have been some kind of internal process or review that examined. And this isn't talking about fake news. I don't know if it's fake news if you don't cover something, and then you figure it out. And I'm not saying that's for the Star Tribune, but I think in general, you know, those portions of the Rust Belt that nobody saw coming is what prompted a lot of that kind of internal, and the Iron Range or the greater Minnesota, you know. And it's clear in some of the coverage I've seen out of your paper, you're paying a lot more attention to it.
So after the election, we did a series, we called it Trump Country. We sent people to those counties and precincts that voted for Trump, and we're just interested in talking to why, how did this happen, and it was very interesting.
I will say, I think the feedback, and I can't speak for, I think it's probably true of journalists on all platforms. There was a time when certain people in television were insulated from the harshest of feedback. The calls would come into the switchboard, the letters would come in, and to be honest with you, those of us in management didn't pass along the ugliest of the stuff. We didn't see any advantage in damaging Rick's fragile ego when he was an anchor.
Very fragile.
Guess what? Anchors today, and I'll just use television anchors as an example, don't enjoy that protection anymore. That feedback gets to them through tweets and comments and everything else.
Exactly.
They have undergone quite the transition over the years. The only other thing I want to mention is the Trump phenomenon, I think, is unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. But here in Minnesota, we did have something that at least came close a number of years ago. And I was a television news director when Jesse Ventura was elected governor, and that was an eye-opening, illuminating experience.
Back then we were just jackals. Nobody suggested we were fraudulent jackals.
We were genuine jackals, though, not fake jackals. And I will tell you, I remember viewers watching very carefully an arched eyebrow, a facial expression, even on election night, that seemed to show surprise, or worse yet, shock at what had just happened. Viewers were all over that. And when occasionally they thought they detected a tone of disrespect, let's say on the part of one of our reporters in reporting on our new governor, because he had an unorthodox manner of speech, as you may recall. The message we got was, you know what? Shut up. We're more like him than we are like you. Yeah. And we took that to heart.
Getting to this notion of kind of the public's role in all of this with the fake news thing. You know, you don't know what you don't know. So how if you don't know that it's fake, you know, how can you not, you know, keep yourself from perpetuating it or whatever else? A few slides I want to run through here before I jump into the audience. This guy.
This is pretty fun.
This guy is something else. Paul Horner.
That was good.
Now, you guys are probably going to have, yeah, if you want to see these, you're going to have to step out a little bit. But Paul Horner, he was interviewed on CNN a while back, a prolific fake news producer, okay? Says he hates Donald Trump, okay? But his strategy, if you could call it that, was to produce an extraordinary volume of completely fraudulent stories lionizing Trump that Trump's people would see and socialize, and then they would look like idiots because it wasn't true. I'm thinking, wow, dude, you're counting on a lot of pins to fall to make this strategy of yours work. And as Paul Horner later came to say, it was like nobody was checking anything. This guy, through a tiny, tiny little fraction of a penny CPC on websites all over the place, was earning, with his fake stories that went viral one after another, 10 grand a month in advertising revenue on those pages, okay? This is what fake news can look like. By the way, so Google was indexing his stuff too, by the way. He wasn't just fooling the public, right? Google was indexing this stuff and putting it up, so crediting it to ABC News, and I'm going to show you why that's also false. But the Amish America commit their vote to Donald Trump, guaranteeing him a presidential victory. Okay, this was an actual fake story, actually indexed by Google right before the election. And this activity is one thing that helped it go social. I'm trying to think. There we go. So this is the story. Check this out. Where does it look like that's from? ABC News. And if you could see the URL on this, it would say, it did say, abcnews.co. Not abcnews.com. One moral of the story is, try to look at the URL. Is it what it appears to be, right? So it turns out Horner owned abcnews.co, and he was posting these crazy stories there. Another thing that you might catch, so, look at the URL. Where is it telling me? Does that make sense? What do I get when I go to that site, generally, right? Does this appear to be credible? Another thing is the story that you're latching onto, wherever it is, findable somewhere else? If it's such a big story, like the Amish throwing the vote for the president, you'd think it would show up on another channel. The headline itself, to Maria's point, if it doesn't seem real, see if you can find it somewhere else. This was another one, right after the election. Obama signs executive order declaring investigation into election results. Revote planned for December 19th. Okay, this one went everywhere as well. Again, headlines. What? Another thing to look for is bylines. Okay? But Paul Horner knows that, so he just wrote one, Jimmy Rustling. And it's clickable. And if you click on it, you go to Jimmy's page, which says he's found solace comforting, knowing he's got, multiple 14 Peabody Awards, a handful of Pulitzer Prizes, and enjoys being an amazing husband to his beautiful soulmate, Anastasia, a Russian mail-order bride. He also spends 12 to 15 hours every day teaching their adopted 8-year-old Syrian refugee daughter how to read and write. So Paul goes, yo, this is satire. Okay? Only nobody knows they're reading The Onion. Okay? That's the issue here. They think they're reading ABC News. And they're curious about Jimmy. What the hell? He said to the Washington Post, hey, look, people are definitely dumber. They just keep passing stuff around. Nobody fact checks anything anymore. It was kind of the moral of story. Oh, just a couple of points here. I kind of made them along the way, but know where you are. What does the domain say, right? abcnews.com is not abcnews.co. Pay attention to bias. I mean, this is clearly a biased piece, Acknowledge that. And again, see if you can find anywhere else. Corroborating authenticity. Is there a date on this thing? Is there a reporter identified? Okay. So that's what fake news can look like, right? That's the way it can get socialized. Really curious. I wanted to ask. I wanted to get the panel to ask, I'm looking for a little optimism as we go into the audience and let them, bring us right back to the pessimistic reality that we're dealing with. This next generation of journalists coming up, dealing with stuff we really, frankly, couldn't even imagine. I mean, seriously. Everything from the disintermediation. I remember when cable was a threat. Remember that? It's kind of funny now.
Quaint.
Right? I mean, what kind of advice do you give them today for how to look at what they're going into as a career? Let's make these short answers and let's go to the audience right next.
Well, you did just give some of it, Rick. I mean, I teach an intro course with 192 students in it, and we talk almost every day that we meet about media literacy, but even more broadly about critical thinking. What is it that ought to pop up as a red flag? It doesn't even really look like an ABC logo. It says it, it's the same general concept, but the hints aren't that deeply hidden in the material that you've shown us. So building those critical thinking skills, developing that skepticism that we've all known is essential to journalism, that succeeds with progress, with practice, and with hard work over years. But it starts with asking good questions. Is that really an ABC logo? What's the URL on this? And at least, young people aren't typically as intimidated by technology as some of us are. So I do think there's reason for optimism, but I don't think we can take it for granted. They didn't grow up or work for decades hearing, if your mother says she loves you, check it out, right? They go that, wow, I never heard that before, right? That's the oldest axiom in journalism. It's new to them, and we talk about why, you wouldn't mean that literally, but why would you check out a thing like that?
I hire interns, I hire beginning reporters. I am optimistic because the people we get either from the U or other places, they're smart. I don't know if it's just journalists who grow up this way, but they question everything and they don't take anything for granted. I can tell them, hey, how about this, this, and this? And they're like, I'm like, just do it this way until you learn to do it yourself. But I'm optimistic. I don't think I'd go to work every day if I wasn't. I'm an internal optimist, and I think that I tell them, you're the good guys. You're bringing the light. This. If you don't do this, who's going to do this?
I don't really hire, or I have an intern here and there, but it's the skepticism. Not just maybe by having to be more skeptical about their sources that they're seeing online, that can be drummed into them about everything, including the government officials that they cover, on a regular basis, as well as just going out and doing their job covering news events that happen. But that kind of skepticism, I'm wondering if it's still out there, frankly, and maybe this can be a way of rekindling it if it's not.
Okay, guys, questions out here. What is on your mind? Yes, sir. What's your name?
Dan Smith, and I was intrigued because I've tended to believe the mainstream media, for the most part, though, have always had this general perception that it had a little bit of a bias either to the right or to the left. And yet I wonder, is there some kind of a code with which you work that keeps the editorializing separate from the news, and is there an expectation that you're presenting all sides of an issue?
Long, forever and forever, editorial is separate from the news pages. We're in our building, we're on separate floors. We don't even see them. They do their thing. They write what they write. They are the voice of the paper. And we are doing news stories where we're looking for, like you said, traditionally, this point of view, this point of view, this side. And so there isn't. And we work really hard, and sometimes we fail. But we work really hard to just suck out any perception of a point of view from straight ahead news stories. And so I read everything. And so if there's a hole somewhere, or if there's, hey, we quoted 2 Democrats and there are no Republicans in this, can you go, call someone and get this? So separate operations totally.
I can verify the firewall because we send over op-eds all the time and to the editorial page and have a great relationship with them. But the few times that somebody who does send it over doesn't understand that you don't talk to a news reporter who's covering the same issue that you happen to be editorializing on, they get their hand slapped right away. Not by me, by the folks on the editorial page. But one thing that doesn't really, I don't know how this fits in, but, and not to pick on the Strib, but I will, but it's the comments section, and that has become...
Do you mean online?
Online comment section has been something in my arcane way I tracked last year, and actually, who's the fellow in charge of it again?
Terry Sauer.
Yeah, Terry, and I used to actually blog for the paper, so... I got to know Terry that way, and then they changed that format. And so the comment section are just simply turned off, on certain subjects. Yep. And I asked him what subjects those are, and I wrote a couple of major pieces about it because I think that opens up the question whether you trust your readers, whether you trust people to... Of course, you got to monitor... for obscenities and that sort of thing. But they're just simply closed off. They are off limits for conversation at that paper, in spite of the fact that they actually drive a lot of interest in online clicks, I would think, too. So that's just one of the questions I've had over time as to, and Terry did get back to me, and I wrote what they have very specific subjects that are off limits, or the way, and that struck me as odd for a paper that's in the business of spreading information.
So we don't allow comments on stories, usually crime stories, typically stories that are about race, and there's another one, because we have a crew of people who monitor the comments. So if there's bad language, if there's blatant racism or sexism or any of that stuff, those get wiped out. It would take them forever to deal with those stories. And so it's just not worth it. There are some people who just insist on trolling, and it is not, they're not contributing to a healthy discussion. And so on those stories, we just choose not to have comments at all.
On many of those same stories, I check the Washington Post, because the national ones, international ones, because once in a while terrorism falls into that category, and the Pioneer Press, and about 99% of the time, they were all allowing comments on stories that weren't in the paper. And maybe that's been narrowed since then, because I do see, I think that's changed a little bit. I get that impression. I don't know if it has or not, but.
Let's take another question here, sir.
I was wondering if there is or could be some sort of mainstream media debunking service news that people could just plug a URL into. Verified false, verified true, not verified, something like that. Would that
the Snopes of fake news, right? Is essentially what you have.
Would that be helpful, or would it just make them run the rabbit hole?
I actually think that journalists use Snopes and other sort of debunking resources. I think it would be a tough one to execute. It's a really enticing, interesting concept. To get journalists to collaborate on something like that would be a tall order, I think.
I don't think it would happen.
Yes, ma'am, right over here. What's your name?
I'm Kathy, and I have 2 comments. First of all, when you talk about fake news and then you say go to Snopes, there's a lot of people who say Snopes has its own bias, so I don't trust them either.
Right.
And how do you get? I don't understand how to get around them. Secondly, it's one thing to talk to this room of probably fairly educated people and say, be critical, be selective, look at the URLs, whatever. But people who are just living in their bubble, they just want to see the news that agrees with them. How do we combat that?
I think that may be the biggest challenge of all, is that these days more people define truth as agreement with me and bias as disagreement with me. And I don't have time to be bothered by all those people who are wrong. So I'm going to go where I know I will encounter only what is right, meaning my opinion. And that is troubling to me. And I think that's about civic engagement of the most important kind. I think, you know, what we need is for people to seek out opposing opinion. I don't know how you get them to do it in all cases.
That is a hard thing to address. I mean, we like to think in our pages you will not find stories that where you could agree or disagree. And I don't work on the editorial page, but I know that there's Doug Tice and there are different voices where they all, you know, they talk about it and they contribute. And so we're trying to offer people a diversity of voices that way. But it is hard. I mean, I think people just kind of know what they think they know what they know, and that's all they want to find. But we encourage our young reporters, you know, you need to read a little of everything. You need to be well read and know what other people are thinking. You have to put yourselves in positions to learn that and not just be here.
Sir, what's your name and your question?
Ken Brinkman. And I'd like to go back to Paul Horner in a sense. The internet business model is to pay, advertisers pay to have clicks on things. Big model, followed by Google, followed by YouTube, followed by Facebook. And so you have a story I heard, and this may or may not be true, but if it's not true, it doesn't matter because it points to the whole issue, that there were some teenagers in Montenegro that thought, gee, let's just generate all kinds of ridiculous attention-getting news, and they got clicks, and they made a lot of money off of it. And in the process, spread a whole lot of false news around the United States during the election. So the question is, and I heard the FBI was looking into this, and the question is, what do you do to these businesses like Facebook and Google and so on to make sure that their business model isn't encouraging tremendously wholesale false news?
What kind of corrective measures could be taken by what kind of authority against organizations, big social media outlets? By the way, I mean, these same kinds of stories can also show up at the NewYorkTimes.com. They can also show up at other, you know, the big ones, Gannett, the big companies. But social media is definitely built for the sharing engine. Do you guys have an answer to this notion of what do you do about this? Can you do anything?
I don't know. I don't know. But I think the market would kind of take care of it. If you are a place where people can't trust what your information is, you would lose readers, subscribers, and you would think at some point the market would take care of that. But I think that is a hard one. I don't know who would even police such a thing.
I'm not for that, but in looking into this for tonight, I think I saw that 77% of ad revenue goes to Facebook, Google. I don't know if it was maybe it's just the online ad revenue, and Twitter, and it's their search engines. The bigger picture is, where are they directing people? Behind the scenes, you know, it's not just what is on their platforms, but the search words and what you are limited in seeing. If you have such and such shopping patterns or political patterns, you're never going to see what's over here. That's a big issue. But I know right now, from what I understand in Washington, they are looking at the Facebooks and the Googles and saying they don't have, and again, I don't know that we want to go there, but they don't have to report their political activity. The ads they get the way that you do if you're a broadcaster, or if you're, I'm not saying we want to go there, but maybe that's something that's going to be talked about, I think.
And conveniently for them, they can convincingly claim that, you know, this isn't all curated by human beings in the case of the big names you've mentioned. Now, that's, you know, convenient. It's hard for me to defend Facebook and Google, and they certainly have the resources to do what is responsible, I think. But when algorithms are making decisions, billions of them a day, I think, it's a different playing field. There is some similarity, though, to old media. You know, there have been times, I'll talk about my own, you know, alma mater medium of television, when it seemed that, you know, some stations and some networks would put anything on the air as long as people watched it. That was just about ratings, just as this is about clicks, right? And there was real money, you know, involved there. But in fact, over time, they came to recognize that their brand had a more profound and lasting value that they weren't necessarily willing to erode for short-term gain in all cases. Not that the teenagers in Montenegro, I read about them too, have that concern. We're you know, the accountability, if any, is going to lie at the media companies, for sure.
Sir.
Aaron Pearson. And Scott, U of M journalism grad, so.
Thank you, good to see you.
Yeah.
You might want to wait to hear the question first, Scott, but
All
go
right,
ahead.
So, you know, we've been talking a lot about the legitimately, if you will, fake news, but part of the kind of collateral damage of that, of course, is calling to question the quality of what would be legitimate news. And I think one of the things that I worry about is people questioning facts. And in the interest of finding balance so that you're not biased, feeling like you need to find sources that to speak to the other side when there is no other side. Any comment on that, particularly from, yeah?
Sure. I think for a long time, journalists have been tempted by this false dichotomy notion that there are two sides to every story. I tell my students there are not two sides to every story. For most stories of any importance, there are far more than two sides. And we shouldn't be so simplistic as to say, well, we just interviewed a Holocaust survivor, we better go find a Holocaust denier, right? Come on, we all know that's not right. Can truth be subjective? Yes, but there is such a thing as truth, and it can also be objective. Those are tough. I think it's a cop-out, and I think it's irresponsible to say, hey, we didn't say it was true, we just said he said it. You know, all we did was put it on the air, or, you know, put it on our site. That's not going to preserve the credibility of any media entity, and I think we all know we need to get past that.
This is a real, I mean, he's talking about a very real thing, though. This notion of balance being one he said for every she said.
Yeah.
I've been watching that go on in this market and other markets for a long time, and you look at it, you're like, what the hell? That you don't do that. That is a ridiculous juxtaposition. It looks like 50-50 right here, and it's not, you know, but that is a big thing to get to the bottom of. Sir, you have a question. I'm surrounded by people with questions. So we're going to keep the answers going here, and we've got about 20 minutes left, Sean, don't we? We've got about 20 minutes left here, and we can take in a lot more questions in that time. Let's do it.
So my name's Jeff Spencer. A friend of mine turned me on to a website called allsides.com, which has a column for like sources from the left, sources from the right, and sources from the middle. And it's pretty interesting to get out of my bubble. So I wanted to bring that up, but also I found myself defending that the Earth is round the other day.
That the Earth is
round. And there's no other side to that. I'm sorry. So the other thing that frustrates me about the fake news is you have people like Rush Limbaugh and InfoWars bringing out the drivel that they spew and then defend themselves by saying we're entertainers.
Let's get to your question, buddy.
Yeah, so how do you deal? I mean, the thing is that when you say the market's going to sort that out, the market's not sorting it out. It's
When?
When's that going to happen?
Anybody know when?
Any moment now.
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
people have to keep reading. They have to keep talking to their friends. They have to keep, sort of batting down things that are not true, and pointing people to, well, here's what I read, and just engaging. But when they say they're entertainers, when they fall back on that, I think they're not being truthful with their audience, because they're putting stuff out that as fact. This is true. This is what happened.
Just
and then
to complicate,
say,
to complicate that a little bit, it's frightening. And I saw a survey on this some years ago. How many young people cite as their principal news source Jon Stewart, who never claimed to be a journalist, right? That blurring is really an issue. I admire our print colleagues for that strict separation of church and state that Maria described. I also am one of very few people who actually believe that it occurs. I know that it does, but I also know that most readers would say, well, that's, they don't buy that, right? They just don't believe it, even where it does occur.
What's your question?
I'm glad you brought up The Daily Show. That you talk about fake news. I know it was satire and so on. That is not the way a lot of kids looked at it. Not even close.
No, they took it very
that.
seriously.
And that, they believed it, and they couldn't process it, or I guess, I don't know where it's gone, under the new regime and so on. But anyway, that is where the blurring, I think, really went mainstream almost, or big time, where. But also it happens, I think, on blogs where, we use content from mainstream media sources, add our commentary into it. We do it on our website, and we make it really clear, I think. We try to, so we're not trying to, but a lot of blurring of lines that I never saw coming when I was starting out in radio, then TV, and then, finally going online, full circle. But it's the Daily Show, the Colbert Report, all of them, I think, are a major piece of the puzzle.
Sir, your question and name?
My name is Kevin, and my question, a comment and a question. So you talked about originally news was obviously biased, right? So back in the 18th, 19th century, newspapers were clearly biased and people understood that. In the 20th century, news acquired this patina of objectivity, culminating with Walter Cronkite saying that's the way it is, right? Except that he said that after saying that North Vietnam obliterated U.S. and South Vietnam forces out in the Tet Offensive in 1968, which was a lie. And Ken Burns is talking about that whole topic right now, right? And so, I look at today now and I see the obvious fake news. I don't really care about Montenegrin teenagers, right? I don't want to talk about that. In the middle you have Powerline blog, news sources, right? So, Tom works for John, who founded Powerline blog, who, by the way, made his name blowing up CBS News for pure, utter lies, propaganda put out from the left. And so now we have the New York Times and the Washington Post. And what strikes me is that they're saying we are objective. And I think there's no way to credibly say the New York Times is objective. And I want to know, do you think the New York Times is objective? And if so, give me your definition of objectivity.
I think objectivity is an aspiration of journalists, and I think it's a sincere aspiration of, I don't happen to know that many people at the New York Times, but I think you can see real efforts to provide a breadth of coverage that's fairer. I don't think it's as simple as both sides. And you touched on something else that may be a road we don't want to go down, but when something is wrong, journalists struggle with this all the time. When and how do we characterize it as a lie, which carries a clear implication of knowledge and intent to deceive, and when is it simply wrong and untrue? Not that that's okay, but it can be a different thing.
Objectivity, we look at an issue, a set of facts, and try to suss out what, as we can determine it, what is true, and we tell readers that. And we don't, there are times when you have people, reporters, others, who you start to shade over and you detect something in the reporting or writing, and we correct for that. And we admit when we make mistakes, when we know that we make them.
I started doing, I think, this recently, right? My question is New York Times, Washington Post.
I wouldn't conflate the two of them either. I actually read more of the Washington Post than I do the New York Times. And I really do think that pure objectivity is probably unattainable, but I do find it largely fair, and I do encounter a diversity of opinion and of perspectives in the news reports of the Post as well, as I do with certain national broadcast brands. I think NPR does a really good job. I know it has a reputation as being liberal, but I hear a lot of very articulate, persuasive, conservative voices from various points on the spectrum on National Public Radio.
Hey, I used to work there.
There you go.
Okay.
All things considered.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
No,
All right.
that was a long time ago.
Name, question.
I'm Brian Smith. My question is, I think I'm a small-time public official as well as a marketing professional, and I think my reaction from my experience on a city council, as well as my experience over the last few years watching our public discourse, the blurring of the line that I'm concerned about is the blurring of the line between facts and feelings. And in my role on the city council, more and more, I can dump facts on somebody all day long, and they'll just say, well, I just don't believe you because it's not consistent with how I feel about this. What is the role that's playing for you in your profession? And then what do you feel is your role to help people through that process in our discourse? Because I think it's, when we talk about objectivity and those things, I think I look at things that are objective, that are consistent with my feelings and my values, and I think of things as biased that are outside of that, right? And I think that that's an easy way to go. And so I guess I'm kind of throwing that out, that idea of fact and feeling, and how does that navigate for you?
Can I just say, I tell my students that the opposite of objectivity is not bias. The opposite of objectivity is subjectivity. Subjective means that something can be interpreted in a lot of different ways depending on the interpreter, right? So we teach journalists to write objectively if possible, and use examples like, instead of saying there was a huge crowd, there were about 100 people there, all right? Huge means different things to different people. 100 means 100. Is that more or fewer than expected? That's up to you to gauge, right? That's judgment, that's subjective. Objectivity is describing things in as impartial a way as we can.
The reporter's feelings should not come into play with the reporting. The feelings come when you choose which stories to do and how to tell them, but their feelings should not come into the workspace, because if they're interviewing you, can I ask you what city you're from? Okay. You ever deal with any of my reporters?
What I'm talking about, the way people feel, not like their emotions, but
No.
the way they feel about something.
Right.
If that's inconsistent with the facts, then the facts don't seem to matter.
But the facts should matter.
Agreed.
The facts should matter. And there, I don't know who the reporter is, but in looking, they need to look if they've had a relationship with you, what have you done on the council, what kinds of projects have y'all worked on together, and that person, most reporters, if they've had a beat for a while, come to know the subjects that they're reporting on. And
what I'm talking about, to be clear, I'm talking about constituents more often than reporters having the issue of mixing those facts and feelings.
Okay. Wow.
The subjectivity, I always thought, came in exactly what you were just alluding to, which is what you choose to cover. And I figured that out really early on. Yep. I like just covering stuff I was interested in, right. But that is really, and once you decide what you're covering, then you cover it. But that's where the the creativity comes in, or that's the wild card that I always found was what really kind of determines then how you cover it.
Right. Here, and to be clear, you're talking about the audience, and they're the distinguished line between their
I think you just got a reporter in trouble.
No,
I'm just kidding.
Not in the Yes.
That's good.
Tell them what your dad is too while we're here. Don't hate me.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I actually graduated from the Little Wagon. My dad was Robert T. Smith, who used to write for the Tribune.
Columnist for a long, long time at the Strip, and wrote a lot about him, actually, growing up. Brian has a lot of material as a 5-year-old, 10-year-old.
So he's probably scarred by the media in ways that we can't even understand.
Sir, tell me your name and your question.
My name is Moody. There's a background to my question. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I watch random videos on Twitter. And so there was this whole situation of Donald Trump making a wrestling move on a CNN advocate. I don't know if you guys saw that video. It led to a whole fiasco about CNN blackmailing the person who put out the video. My question about that is, we have a level of expectation for mainstream media, expecting them to give us pure, unbiased news. At what point do they cross that line and give us more justification for being called fake news, in a sense?
Right. So I know the meme you're talking about. This was just the president in a moment. He was just passing along something somebody else created, right? Happened to involve him from his days in the wrestling community, industry, whatever that is. I don't know how that reflects on CNN at all, to be honest with you. I mean, that's just something that someone did to have some fun at the expense of CNN, and the president found it amusing. But that wasn't ever, I don't think that was ever offered up as something to be taken too literally, right? That wasn't really news. It was a meme. It was a goofy thing somebody manufactured. So I don't know if that one's relevant to CNN's own credibility, except that it shows that, there are a lot of people out there with some hostility towards CNN.
Other questions in this crowd? You have a follow-up?
My question is more around the fact that they did follow up on the story and make it a whole. There was a big fiasco with it on them.
That CNN reported on it.
They
okay.
Did,
I'm sorry.
Time Magazine picked it up and said they were blackmailing the person who made the meme, and it became a whole event.
I'm not familiar enough with the details of the coverage to really judge how well it was done, but I will say, I think sometimes the media do have to cover themselves when they become wittingly or unwittingly part of the story. I don't necessarily think it's the moral high ground to say we're simply not going to report on that because it involves us. It's a tough one, though, when you're covering a story in which you've become a player. I do think that challenges journalists greatly.
And I think, not knowing a lot about, I saw this story, I think they have their brand to protect. I mean, you can't let somebody use your brand in that way and not address it. And I think that's what they were trying to do in that case.
Jan.
Is there a danger these days with so many reporters being on Twitter and the more casual, interactive nature of that, where their feelings come out and then it's difficult for news consumers to separate that persona from pure objectivity as they write stories?
Do you have a policy on that? I wonder.
So each reporter is on Twitter. If they choose to be, there's some who don't want to deal with that and they aren't. But it's a good way to, you tweet the link to your story and it drives traffic to our website. So it's all about getting people on the website and reading the stories. We have had very frosty discussions with some reporters when they express an opinion. You cannot express an opinion. you can't do it because the next time you write a story about Mr. Smith and you've already gone on Twitter and said something about Maplewood, like we can't have that happen because that goes to our credibility, and our credibility is all that we have. Our reputation is all that we have. So while we're encouraging reporters to be on Twitter, engage with the public that way, tweet the links to your stories, drive traffic to our website, there's a fine line between building your brand, having people know who you are and want to engage with us that way because that builds our audience, and expressing an opinion that will get you in trouble or call into question your objectivity and your ability to cover stories in a way. There was we've had reporters, after the election, they all are so passionate. They feel so strongly about the work we do and what is happening in the country. And we had to tell people, like, shut it down, stop that. You cannot go on Twitter and say, blah, 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 and Trump this. Like, you just can't do it. That makes you useless to me when I need you to go out to Blue Earth County to cover something that is related to, an election. So we are very strong.
Maria, do you get the idea, though? You're on a kind of shrinking island with that point of view. I mean, there are other media properties.
And I will stand on my island.
You stand on you said both feet.
Both feet. Just me.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say, as credible media properties in this town clearly aren't having those kind of conversations with reporters. I mean, there are reporters, and you go through a list of names, but you know them, and it's all about their point of view out there, and they're reporters. Yeah.
I got to say, as a recovering news manager, a lot of the fault here, I think, belongs at the management level. I think you're probably ahead of the curve. Editors and managers are getting better. You sound like you've been a lot more precise. But to talk about television, my own medium, social media kind of caught us off guard. And too many news directors and general managers and, yes, promotions people told reporters, let people hear your voice. What? Well, what does that mean? No, be a little more casual and authentic on Facebook or Twitter. And then, of course, reporters went out and took risks and said some inappropriate things, and some of them got fired for it. And the managers, of course, said, well, that violates everything we believe in. But they didn't give them adequate guidance on how to use these new channels. And I think it's only been the last few years that media organizations have begun to establish clearer guidelines.
Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up question here to this.
Yeah, this is Sean. It's a comment, you can react to it. Would newsrooms work better if in some ways they were more like editorial rooms? In that I can think of news sources not up on the panel tonight where I know every reporter has the same opinion, and you can just hear that come out in the reporting. And I think there's something, it comes up in our work at the Citizens League, when you have to say something and have someone with a different opinion say, well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I wonder if part of it lies in the management of the newsroom. Again, I'm not thinking of the Strib necessarily, but I just know, you can just tell that no one in that newsroom has an opinion that disagrees with that, and so they wander off into areas that, are biased in my opinion, and they don't know it. And it's supposed to be news.
I think some newsrooms could benefit from more intellectual and ideological diversity. And I certainly tried as a news director to hire people who brought perspectives to the table that weren't already represented. And I was very fortunate to work in newsrooms where I don't think you could say, oh, it's pretty clear where all of them are, because we had some very lively discussions and differences. And I think that's healthy in a newsroom.
I think there are, people hire people who are like them. And for years there was a certain kind of person in management, and we are conscious of it and try to change that. I mean, but in an interview, you're not going to ask somebody, who'd you vote for? I mean, you want the report. We're hiring smart people who can look for that diversity of voice.
You have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so today, a lot of local or regional stories can go viral, and how does that change how you report on things, or does it? In the past, maybe your audience you knew was super local, but now that audience could potentially be the world.
I guess I don't think of, we don't approach the story that way, thinking, oh, this could go viral. I mean, if we've, so viral for us, like when we're talking on website, page views is 10,000 page views, 20,000 page views. Those are stories that go crazy. Some things are, you just know. Anything about Prince is gonna, I mean, we get comments, at dead or alive, comments from around the world on that. But we don't approach it like, ooh, is this gonna go viral? I mean, we're just trying to tell the best story. Does that answer your?
I think it raises the stakes for even tiny local news organizations. Back in the 90s, we used to joke irreverently about how, I'm not really worried that some terrorist in a cave in Afghanistan is going to see our newscast. Well, guess what? Today, anything that goes online can be accessed from anywhere, and we really do have to think, even if we're fundamentally local news organizations, about the global reach, and even to think about some of the perverse uses to which things have been put. So if we choose not to put something on air because it's very graphic or troubling, but we put it online where people can go see it, are we also enabling its use as propaganda by some nefarious organization? Those are considerations we didn't have to worry about 15, 20 years ago.
But there are a lot of online sites that, just do click stories, just, the top 5 reasons why this, that, or the other thing. So
that's their brand, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions from the group here tonight? That was thorough. Really, let's thank the panelists here this evening, first of all. And I don't know, any particular closing remark or particular even point that you were hoping to get to make here tonight that you did not?
Yeah, I forgot to plug the organization that I lead. I don't lead the University of Minnesota. I get paid by the University of Minnesota. But I am the chairman of an organization called the Radio Television Digital News Association, RTDNA. And if you're interested in these issues, so are we. And I would love for you to visit our site, rtdna.org, not co or anything like that, org. We are, I believe, the largest professional organization of electronic journalists, principally. And we're very interested in these issues. We're very interested in First Amendment issues. So if you are, we'd love to have you connect with us in any way you choose to, or just consider us as a resource, rtdna.org.
If you are Star Tribune readers, thank you. If you're not, come see me. Engage with us, ask us questions. We are a community resource. Our editors on down, we believe that, and so we're open to talking to our readers about what it is that we do and how we can do it better and how we can serve our communities.
I work now at do government accountability reporting and communications for a policy group called Center of the American Experiment. We're at americanexperiment.org. We have a thriving website with a lot of different content, and we have a quarterly magazine called Thinking Minnesota. You can find it in Barnes and Noble, or it's also up to 60,000 for circulation. So I think it's the second biggest magazine in the state.
Thank all of you guys, and thank you guys tonight. Great questions, great participation.